Hello and welcome to Behind the Story. I'm Sebastian Gomes, an executive editor at American Media. Well, we made it through election night, but at this point, ballots are still being counted in key battleground states that will eventually determine the presidential race. And that uncertainty brings with it a great deal of anxiety, fear, frustration, maybe even despair. So it's important to take a moment to pause, take time to pray, to reflect on all of that as we watch and wait for the final results. And even if the results are in by the time you watch this, it's still very important to take time to pause and reflect. And to help us do that, I'm joined by Father Matt Malone today. He's the president and editor-in-chief of American Media. Matt is a Jesuit priest. He's also very well versed in politics, so I asked him to come on the show and offer some political perspective, but also some spiritual guidance and encouragement. Hi, Matt. Thanks for being here for our YouTube audience today.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Now, before we get started, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel and comment below. Let us know how you're feeling about election night, how you're dealing with this period of uncertainty, or ask us a question and we'll get back to you. So Matt, there were predictions, obviously, that this would happen on election night, that more time would be needed to count the historic number of mail-in ballots, especially in the battleground states. It's an extremely tight race. We're now in this period of uncertainty, and that's really what I want to focus on. I know you're following the results closely, but as a Jesuit priest, what's going through your mind right now?
Well, I think as a Catholic Christian and as a priest, I'm struck by how hope and fear are universal human experiences. You know, in of course, in our faith tradition, Jesus, the one who is hope, casts out fear. Right? But it's also, hope and fear are also what structure political campaigns. Results of elections are forged in the crucible between hope and fear. And successful politicians either play to one or the other, either nobly or cynically, depending on who they are. But it's also, that's always been a part of political campaigns, but it also strikes me that it has metastasized by virtue of social media, the number of platforms that are covering elections, the number of channels, and also the way in which politics has become our kind of national pastime.
Did anything surprise you from election night? It's obviously not the first time that you've watched one, but in light of what you just said, was there anything different about this one?
I mean, there were some things that were different in terms of how the demographics of the election result played out, but by and large, it went pretty much as predicted. The polls were off at a state level in places like Florida, but for the most part, it was pretty clear all along that it was going to be a long count from when the polls closed to when we knew the final result. Number two, that it was going to it was either going to be close or it was going to be a landslide, and that the cone, as it were, of prediction between those two is relatively narrow. And number three, that we were going to see a polarized country. That's the reality in which we live. I mean, there were some of the things that really struck me as interesting were the number of Latinos who voted for the president, which I think a lot of people in the media, and perhaps those of us who live in the Northeast, did not expect. That's a question the Democratic Party is going to have to ask itself, how that happened. Also, the number of white voters, particularly along in places like the Ohio Lakeshore, who came back to the Democratic Party. So there's clearly a demographic mix-up taking place. It'll be some time before we see whether it's a proper realignment.
Voter turnout in this election was up, which is good for a democracy, obviously. And I think, you know, people on either side, including Catholics, there are 50 million some odd Catholics who are eligible to vote, you know, felt it was obviously this year very important to vote, right? And it might not have been because they were particularly enthusiastic about Donald Trump or about Joe Biden, but to some degree it might have been just because they felt like they had to stop the other candidate or had to stop the other party from gaining power. And I wonder what you make of that we seem to be an emerging electorate that is more focused on stopping the other or defeating the other rather than, you know, being very enthusiastic or excited about a party platform or policies that can really, you know, help push forward the common good.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the extent to which that's an accurate description of people's motivations. I mean, I do think there is clearly a scapegoating that's happening on both sides. It's what happens in a polarized world, right? It's not just two groups of people who disagree with each other, because that's just democracy. It's two groups of people, each of whom thinks that the other is somehow socially or politically or morally irredeemable. But for the most part, swing voters, and Catholics are, for the most part, swing voters, they're somewhere in between those extremes. And I think that their concerns are more immediate, and they're probably not thinking in broad terms. But to the extent that dynamic is at play, it's obviously very dangerous for the country. It's hugely destabilizing to the electoral process.
And I think a lot of people were hoping that this election would bring some degree of unity, right? I mean, after 4 years of President Donald Trump, in which it seemed to further polarize the country along party lines, that maybe this was a moment, and perhaps the presence of Joe Biden in this race might be a traditional kind of stabilizing force. But as I said, we see voter turnout, up, and then the race is so close. I mean, people are just split right down the middle. So, what do we do? What do we say when the soul of the country was perhaps yearning for that kind of unity and didn't seem to get it on election night, or at least to this point?
Well, I would say there are different ways to achieve unity, right? So one way that the country can be united and express its unity is by having a landslide election result. We don't have that, and we're not going to have that. But there's also a way in which the result that we do have, or it looks like we're going to have, which is a Democrat in the White House, a Republican-controlled Senate, a Democratic-controlled House, affords us an opportunity to work together. So in other words, if we had a landslide, then, and let's say the Democratic Party controlled the White House and all of Congress, then they could have pushed through any agenda of their liking. But now, in order to get anything done, they're going to have to work together. And so there's still an invitation to unity if our political leaders in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are willing to work together. And that this result, in a sense, doesn't necessarily have to be the end of that hope for unity. It could be the scenario in which we actually realize it.
Let's turn to the church. We're talking about the Catholic vote. One of the things I've learned in this election cycle, doing the podcast that we did, Voting Catholic, was just how closely American Catholics resemble America as a society in terms of being split almost right down the middle, which is a very interesting thing to learn and try to grapple with. But in light of that, in light of the fact that the church seems to be the same as American society as a whole, what's the role of the church in this moment? The institutional church, the bishops, what should we expect? What should we be looking for from them in terms of leadership? And then, even just ordinary Catholics, and many of whom have this disunity within their own local community or their own family even.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our responsibility is to model the change that we want to see. And in that sense, if our hope is to be unified, to act as one country, or at least to act in some kind of bipartisan way for the common good, we need to model that behavior ourselves. So we as individuals need to be reaching out to people who voted the other way, people who disagree with us, people who have a different view of the issues. We need to reach out to them, and we need to listen as well as talk. And in terms of our ecclesial leaders, the bishops, I think they should start with where there is agreement between Catholic social teaching and the priorities of the new administration. I suspect that that's what they will do. But the temptation in a polarized world is to say, okay, now we have to erect a bulwark and get behind it and say that far, but not this far, no further. And I don't think the bishops would do that, and they shouldn't.
I want to get back to our spiritual life. There are moments like this, right, along the journey where there's great uncertainty, There's great fear, perhaps despair, as I mentioned off the top. We struggle with control, our sense of control, and that's really what the journey is about: is overcoming that and not letting those things dictate, how we relate to other people or how we have a discourse, with each other. So I'm just wondering, are there lessons or best practices from the spiritual life, the teachings of St. Ignatius that we can turn to in this moment and use to try to help us, stay grounded and stay centered?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say, as somebody who has, in an earlier incarnation of myself many years ago, lived through a number of political campaigns, the morning after an election, you have two groups of people. One group who thinks that the world is ending, and the other group thinks it's actually just beginning, right? And in a funny kind of way, that's how our whole national politics is structured right now. You have two groups of people, folks on the right who are saying the world is ending and we have to save it, and folks on the left who are saying, no, it's just getting started, right? And we need to have a revolution. As Catholics, what we bring to that conversation is a sacramental faith in which we know that grace is what transforms time and space. And what that means is that the world is always ending and it's always just beginning. And that is why the process of engaging in discernment, in reflection, the kind of discernment and reflection that Ignatian spirituality invites us to, is so crucial. Because whatever we do, however we proceed as a country or as at the community level, we have to be able to do that from a place of freedom, so that our interactions with others are actual encounters rather than mere confrontations. I'm reminded of the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He studied at the University of Paris at the height of what was then called the Placards Crisis, which was a bitter, a violent struggle between Catholics and Protestants in Paris. They were literally killing each other in the streets. And yet in Ignatius's autobiography, where he talks about his parish years, he never mentions this. He never mentions what's happening around him. Why is that? It's because he was focused on God and he was focused on the person in front of him. It doesn't mean he was not interested in what was happening around him. It just means that he was free. And that the grace of that freedom is what each of us should be asking for right now.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a few questions about Joe Biden, just to remind our viewers that at the time that we're recording this, it's still uncertain which way the presidential race is going to go. But you've spent time with Joe Biden in the past. It was in 2015, I think just before Pope Francis's visit to the United States, that you had a chance to interview then Vice President Joe Biden. From what you know about him, if he's the next president of the United States, what can you share with the country about who this is, his life, his faith, his perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I did interview him. I had a long conversation with him in 2015. I, of course, don't know him personally, but I saw what a lot of Americans see, which is a good and decent human being, seemingly. In the course of that conversation that we had, I was mindful of the fact that this was the first real interview he had, a sit-down interview, since the death of his son, Beau Biden. And he did have a conversation on Colbert, I think 2 nights before he sat down with me, but this was the first time he had sat down with any kind of journalist for an interview. And I knew that that was going to be very much on his mind. And so a friend of mine shared with him an article I had written about my own father and the death of my brother, so that he would know I had some inkling of what it is like for a parent to lose a child, and that I wouldn't put him in an uncomfortable position by asking him intrusive or awkward questions about it. And then he brought it up without my asking. He brought the story up that about my father that I had written about in America with great care and compassion, and I was very impressed by that. And afterwards, he gave me a message to deliver to my father, which was just between two fathers. And so, yeah, I have one of those Joe Biden stories too, where he does the decent human thing.
And you can watch that full interview. It's on our YouTube channel right now. Another question about Joe Biden. You know, if he's president, in light of everything that we're talking about where the country is right now, especially the seeming polarization, you know, not a great sign of unity as we discussed. What do you think the responsibility of President Joe Biden will be to try to rectify that? How do you think, or what do you think would be an effective way of approaching that?
Well, I think that the defeat of the politics of Trumpism, which I think is the result of this election, is a victory for the country, not just for Joe Biden. And, you know, as we said, the editors of America in our editorial, you know, President Trump, the way he conducted himself in office represented a unique threat to the constitutional order that was really unprecedented in modern American history. And so the repudiation of that, which I think we see even in this result, this very narrow result, is an important outcome, and it's good for the country. And in light of that, then Mr. Biden has to govern for the entire country. You know, we have just spent 4 years being governed by, well, having a president who governed for 40 or 45% of the country. And we see where that has gotten us. He really needs to, the new president needs to govern for the entire country along with Congress, which means doing some difficult things, doing the kinds of things that I just suggested we do on an individual level. He needs to talk to Republicans. He needs to sit down with them. He needs to talk to independents. He needs to bring, he needs to not only fight with some Republicans, he needs to appoint some of them, right? He has to model that kind of leadership for the country.
Thanks very much, Matt. We'll leave it there for now. For complete coverage and analysis of the 2020 election from a balanced Catholic perspective, head over to americamagazine.org. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel before you go, and let us know how you're feeling about the election by commenting below. Thanks very much for watching.